welcome back, leaders. Thanks so much for joining David and I again for this edition of the Innovative Leader podcast. Today, we are talking about leaders and strengths. And strengths is an interesting topic that we think about for our teams. How do we have our teams working to their strengths? And for ourselves, how do we make sure that we're working to our strengths? When we're working to our strengths, we experience the flow of work. It is easy and not a burden. We can have endless energy and productivity with it versus when we're working outside of our strengths, we experience greater burden, we exhaust and tire faster, we struggle more, and the quality of our work is not as great when we're working outside of our strengths. I always like to use the example of working with your left hand or your right hand, depending on which you are. But when you're working with your strong hand, you have unlimited capacity generally. But when you're writing with your weaker hand, you can't do it as well, as long, and the quality is impaired. So it's just a great way to think if we're working in our strengths or not.
Yeah.
So David, all right. So first of all, David and I were talking, and we think there's kind of a process. Today, we're going to talk about 3 different ways to assess your strengths as a leader. So how do you figure out your strengths, your blind spots, and your weaknesses, focusing more on your strengths? 3 ways to do that. But first, we think for every way that you develop your strengths, there's kind of a process that you go through. So David, do you want to talk to us a little bit about how do you assess, how do you figure out your strengths? What do you do to actually grow your strengths?
Yeah. So there, yeah, as we were talking, there were three ideas that came across as part of that process. The first is to assess. So we'll talk about the different ways we can do that in a minute, but assess and identify those strengths, work through them, try to uncover them using the things that we're going to talk about, and identify them, knock those out. And then the second piece of that process is really to expand your awareness of that strength. If it's maybe you're a good ideation person, so what can we do to foster creativity? What can we do to have those pieces in place so that ideation kind of comes to us, and we can build ideas and develop ideas and share those ideas with others. And then the third is just kind of to develop a plan to grow and build those strengths, and then experiment with it. Everything, a lot of what we talk about is feedback, experiment, tweak, those kinds of things. And so as we look at that third piece of the process, we plan how we're going to put it in place. We start, we get feedback, we tweak it. So that all of that really is an experimentation of the plan that we've got in place. And then as you tweak it, you begin to understand it better. You begin to use it better. Those things, and then we get that opportunity to see that strength grow and develop like we would love.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay, good. So yeah, we just think it's an ongoing, infinite process to assess and identify, expand your awareness, because as leaders, we're constantly, self-awareness is your greatest strength, really, to be self-aware and then to plan and experiment. Okay, good. So the first area that we want to talk about is tools. And I am very passionate about assessment tools. David, you also use a lot of assessment tools. Right. What are your favorite tools for identifying strengths in leaders?
So Standout is really good. I really like the Standout tool. I'm planning on taking the one you mentioned earlier last week from Lincoln. Planning on taking that one this week. What is that?
Your Working Genius by Patrick Lencioni.
Mm-hmm. Yep. That's a great one. I think the Enneagram, it's really in vogue, but I think it sheds a lot of insight into your own personality and into who you are. You've always got the
Myers-Briggs.
Myers-Briggs. I can't. Yep. And then the DISC is another one that's really good. And then StrengthsFinder. Did I mention that one already?
I don't think so. You said Standout.
Standout, yeah. StrengthsFinder is another real good one as well. The two that I really like are, or maybe three, is the Standout, the Strengths Finder, and the Enneagram. Those are kind of my three that I kind of go to, because the Enneagram just kind of gives you, I think, from a depth of understanding, I like it a little bit better. And then the Standout and the Strengths Finder, to me, are really beneficial on really uncovering kind of the core of who you are. Other than just, you're a high D. People talk about high D and those kinds of things. That all starts to flow together for me. So
yeah, no, I agree. The reason for me, sometimes in coaching, people will become a coach of a certain assessment,
right.
and it becomes kind of their signature area of work. Generally, I don't particularly ascribe to that, because I believe in coaching, we want to stay on this high level, and we use that as a tool to give us information, to accelerate the process, to give us words and understanding. But right. I do think a misunderstanding, sometimes people take assessments and they feel they're resistant to assessments because they feel like the assessment is telling them who they are, versus right. The assessment is really an inductive tool to say, take the assessment, and then what is the information the assessment is giving us, and what do we think about that? How does it fit? How does it not fit? What is true? What doesn't feel right? And sometimes you can have a reaction. You're like, oh my gosh, I don't really like that. But then you have to stop and look and go, why don't I like that? Is there something I'm resisting about right. this information that could be a blind spot? So assessment tools are really an opportunity, an inductive opportunity to assess and reflect how they fit us, rather than feeling like an assessment is putting you in a box. And also, as leaders, we want to be careful that if we use assessments, that we're not using them to put other people in a box. Right. It's not about putting anybody in a box. It's about learning.
Yeah. And it's also a snapshot in time. People say that the Enneagram, for instance, is it shouldn't change. I've had people who coach with Enneagram say, oh, your Enneagram shouldn't change. But I took the Enneagram maybe 2 years ago, and then I had taken it maybe 10 years ago, 9 years ago, and mine was it changed. And I think it's in many of these cases, you have to realize that it's a snapshot of your life at this moment. In some of those cases, Strength Finder and maybe Standout, those are those have built on your years of living and life and wisdom and experience, and this is kind of who you are and how you've grown and developed and those kinds of things. And so they, in some cases, I think they also kind of build on each other. But to me, they're also a snapshot in time that gives you an idea of where you are and who you are, and then you use those to grow and develop and move toward those strengths. And if things change in the future, if a life experience comes along and all of a sudden, instead of a peacemaker, you're something else and as part of the Enneagram, then or more layers of your life have been peeled back and you're now reflecting, really understanding who you are more, then you move in those directions. So I don't say take it with a grain of salt, but also remember that to me, they're a reflection of who you are at this point in time. You may think that a little bit differently, but like even on the disc, I fluctuated between is it the disc, the introvert and extrovert, and
Myers-Briggs, maybe.
Yeah, Myers-Briggs. Yeah. So I fluctuate in those. It just depends on, I guess, the season of life for me, and in some of those assessments.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I do think that the assessments, it matters what perspective you're taking it from. Right. Sometimes when people are taking it, you have to be careful to not overanalyze and be like, well, when I was a kid, I was like this, and right now I feel like this, but how I want to be is like this.
Right.
That can kind of skew your results because you're not really taking it from a perspective. So I always tell people to try to get in their mind a time when they were really in their sweet spot, in their zone, where they felt fully alive. They felt like they were really using their strengths, like they felt really good about how they were showing up. It was a peak experience time. And then to take the assessment from that perspective, because that will grab more your natural self versus how you've been forcing yourself to adapt. I do think the quality of assessments vary. StrengthsFinder 2.0 is a very scientifically studied, accurate assessment. But even with StrengthsFinder, what they'll talk about is that you have roughly 10 strengths and that they'll reorder depending on different things that you're doing. And again, in the StrengthsFinder, those are strength themes, what you have the capacity to do, but you may not be using the strengths. An interesting thing in the StrengthsFinder and working with that with people over time is sometimes you have a theme, but you actually, because it's a strength, you might have overused it, or you're so good at it that people have given you negative feedback where they're like, oh my goodness, you're so compassionate. You need to just grow some thick skin and not worry so much about what people think. But really, you have this strength of empathy. And so sometimes people accidentally squash that strength. And then you, in your younger years, learn a message that strength is bad and you shouldn't use it. So oftentimes in the process of using the tool of StrengthsFinder, we find that you have strengths that you've actually put away because you mark them as a bad thing that need to be brought back, or they're a strengths theme that you haven't been using and we need to bring those to the forefront. So StrengthsFinder will talk about those reordering. With the DISC, again, I think the perspective is very important. Sometimes if you're too close to that midpoint, you are trying to take the assessment from what you think the answer needs to be versus your authentic and genuine answer. Enneagram, I agree, but that one's where I think it's the quality of the assessment. You know, there's these free assessments out there and they're not as scientifically solid. So I think the first Enneagram assessments that I did were more the free ones versus when I actually paid for the assessment. That is a more scientifically rich assessment with more questions that have to make sure you're in that same zone. So I think that's an important thing to watch out for. My favorites are the DISC, because I think the DISC is a simple way. The DISC and the Myers-Briggs are very compatible, kind of measuring similar things, but yet they're different, definitely different. But I like the DISC because it's more digestible for most people. Executives, companies, Toyota uses the DISC. They have the red, blue, yellow, green, which represents the DISC for what is your primary, in order to help improve communication. So when you understand what your communication style is and someone else's communication style is, you can communicate better. So that's, to me, my base one. My next one that I love is StrengthsFinder. And then you mentioned I love assessments. The Enneagram, I think, is very useful. Standout is an interesting one because that one I do think could change because it's more how others see you versus how you see yourself. So if you're in a different position, a different season of life, I could see that changing. But regardless, I think it's important to take the tool, to reflect on it, to assess how it's showing up, how it's not, to use it to learn. Are you overusing a strength? Sometimes when we overuse a strength, it actually becomes a weakness because we're doing it too much. I'm a command strength. And if I'm overusing that, it's unwelcomed, right? There could be things that are not in our wheelhouse that we're trying to do. So we have to be aware of that. Or we could have a blind spot because we don't have that strength. So we just aren't aware of it. So I just think the assessments are great to expand our awareness and how we operate, communicate, and interact.
Yeah, and also just remember as well that they're really just they're revealing one facet of who you are. So it's not the totality of who you are. It's like the facets of a diamond or a gemstone. They're revealing kind of those facets based on the kind of assessment that they are.
Absolutely. Yes. And I love that too. I always say that the cuts of the diamond,
Yeah,
these are just a different cut of the diamond in the brilliance of who God made you to be.
exactly.
Absolutely. Okay.
The
Number two.
second, yeah, go ahead. I was going to say teams. So pull together your team. I remember when we were working together, the 360 was really strong, and I loved that 360. I'd taken that prior as well. That's a very eye opening as a leader to see what other people think about you and about your leadership style, and I think that's huge to understand.
Absolutely. And the 360 is interesting. So there's one that I like to use called the Reach 360. They actually have a free one. You can use that for 15 days. And there's Career Distinction is the book that goes with Reach 360. And I've used Reach 360 both for myself to understand my brand, the way people see me, how I'm coming across. And the Reach 360 allows from the perspective of friends and family, from coworkers and people on your same level, from people above you who might have led, supervised you, whatever, or just other peer leaders, and then peers. So it's kind of people under, people above, peers, and then your friends and family. So it's this complete 360 look to how are you coming across to the world? And then it is interesting to use the traditional 360, whether that be for leadership or whatever, to ask your team, typically that's your team filling it out, on their perspective or their perception of you and these different skills. But it's a very vulnerable thing to do as a leader, to get that feedback, to hear what people are saying are your blind spots or your shadows. A lot of times teams have to really be encouraged to be honest in those, because people can be very afraid if they're too honest or say there's a area for the leader to improve, that they're going to get in trouble for that. So those can be tough, but 360s are very enlightening to get information that you are not going to get from this side of the table, from your own head.
Yeah, and I think organizations need to I think just going back to especially to both of those early on, from an organizational standpoint, I think we ought organizations need to look at using those, just like you said, Toyota was using the disc, because so I took Standout, and our organization said, hey, it's free. We paid for it. You go take it. So I took it. Nobody asked for it. It was like, only for you. And I'm like, no, my boss needs to know. And other people need to know.
Nobody asked for the results.
Nobody asked for the results. It was just take it. It was like self-illumination. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But take it. But from an organizational standpoint, if your team is taking an assessment, find out what it is, because that's one of the beauties of a 360 as well, is you figure out, you see where your weak spots are in that assessment, and then you can begin to work on. I mean, it's a way to work on some of your weaknesses, whether it's communication or the fact that you don't know how you're communicating and you're only communicating a certain way. Well, if your team had known some of those things coming in, maybe the whole process, maybe the whole leadership experience, maybe the whole work experience would have been completely different. And so I think that's the value of the 360. It's also the value of organizations using those assessments as you onboard, as part of an onboarding process. Sorry, I kind of took a shift left there, but that popped in my head. I thought we might just mention that for a second. So
no, I think it's really important, and it's a great point, because even as leaders are doing this, to share that information versus like, great, I have this information, I'm going to tuck this under my desk. Because the point, and I think it's another sign of misunderstanding the assessments, that sometimes when we take assessments, we don't share the information because we don't want people to put us in a box. We don't want to be misunderstood for what we're embarrassed as a leader. You know, for me, being a high command, whatever, I'm strategic command activator or whatever, so significance and communication. So for me, when people look at that, I'm like, oh, they're not going to see all my human side. They're going to think whatever. And I don't think that. I think it's great. Like, you share your strengths so that you're not misunderstood, so people understand the perspective you're coming from. But really, that is the point why when your team is taking a test, you want to understand, what was your assessment? What did you get from that? How accurate do you feel that is? What do you think it says about you? And how does that resonate with you? Where do you see that being accurate in your life?
Right.
And what does it mean? How does this help you? And so we want to use the assessments to be a starting point for conversations to understand people better. And as a leader, same thing. We want to use that as a starting point with our team so they understand us better. Not that the team needs to change themselves to work to our benefit, but it's a two-way street. When you're taking an assessment as a leader, turn around and give it to your team, not so you're like, hey, I did the strengths finder. I'd like to let you know all my strengths. No, have your team take the strengths finder too, and then have a table discussion about it.
Right.
So you can appreciate and really grow in using everybody's strengths. So yeah, I love that point about sharing.
Yeah. And I think, when you do that, then you can realize, hey, this person over here, they need to be communicated to in a different way. They're focused on something else. And when you're handing out tasks or projects or those kinds of things that need to be done, then you know who you can go to based on those strengths. And then from the third standpoint, it helps you understand the other person, which in a Leadership 4.0 world is huge. And it shows your ability to be vulnerable if you're sharing out first. And that creates a safe space for your team to be able to share, not just about themselves in that instance, but if there's a problem that comes up, something that needs to be communicated, an issue, then that gives them that safe space to do that. So anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think we can't really emphasize that enough. And even building even more on what you're saying, I think it helps us as leaders to make better decisions, to communicate better, and to work better. Often leaders will, not always, but let's say you're that high D leader or a high C leader. And it depends on if you're in that visionary mode and you're really focused on moving things ahead. And then you're in an engineering company, you're in a technology company, you're in a company where you've got a team of high SCs or CSs, the detail oriented, the more introverted, the loyal, usually slower to adapt because they're moving more pieces. It's not that they are unskillful at adapting, but they've got 100 things to move versus a lot of times people who move quickly have things, they've got 10 things to move. So they're like, right, what's the big deal? Let's just move. Well, there's all these pieces connected that a detail person is going to see the ramifications or the ripple effects, and they want to take care of those things. So as a leader, we want to understand, how am I the same as my team? How am I different from my team? And that you realize that sometimes the perspectives that we have are very influenced by our profiles and by the way we see the world through our strengths and our styles. And so, for example, with that one, and I work a lot because I'm high D, I like to work with people who are like me and people who aren't like me. And so it doesn't really matter. But with other fellow high D leaders, our classic mistake is not sending out meeting agendas beforehand. And what is the topic that's going to be discussed so people have time to think about it? Because the D will show up at the meeting and then they'll announce what they're going to talk about, and then they want immediate feedback. Right. And that SC profile is like, I have nothing to say. I'm going to have to think about that. I haven't really thought about that. I'm going to have to think about that. And for a D, that's very odd, because a D almost always has an opinion in the moment. It doesn't matter. They don't actually need to think about it. If you ask them to think about it, they're going to forget about it. So that doesn't make sense to them. But an SC needs time to think about it. So these tools are not just to understand people, but it's really to increase the way we perform and the way that we work. So they're critical, whether it's the 360 or the assessment. But I know we're running out of time. So let's move to that third one, is understanding ourselves. How do we use that one?
Yeah. So, that's where you hole up somewhere, get in your thinking chair, go away for a day or two, and just explore. You can take those assessments and even the 360s, and kind of assess where you are, figure out, where you fit and what's your strengths, and move on. But it's a time where you can get together. You do that self-assessment. in football, they call it self-scouting, where you look at what you're doing, how you're doing it, the way you're doing it, and you evaluate that. Is this effective? It may be effective in this situation, but it's not effective over here. So begin to apply what you're doing, examine it based on different scenarios, different people, and explore that, and then really come to the conclusion of, I need to change X because Y and Z. I need to change the way I communicate to Bob because they just don't get it when I just share facts. They need a story. Mm-hmm. They need an email instead of a phone call. They need a text instead of. So it's how you do things. It's why you do things. You look at motivation, and then you look at the scenarios in which we're doing that, and when you do that, you can kind of come to an understanding really of who you are. You can engage a coach. That's another way to do some self-assessment. Let them kind of see how they see your world and your life and how you function. And that's a great tool as well. I think most everybody should have a coach in their life. So those are two big things in self-assessment.
Yeah, good. Right. So, and I know it might seem a little bit confusing between, so really we're saying number one is about tools. So you're self-assessing using a tool, but really the tool is giving you their lens or their framework. So StrengthsFinder has 34 themes. So you're going to self-assess, but it's giving you results within the 34 themes. And then the team assessment is whatever that 360 is also a guided around certain content. And really this third point is more free form. It's more intuitive, self-deductive, self-reflective, really is this third area of the self is just open self-reflection. And I think an interesting thing, and really often what's happening in coaching is it's not that we're telling you who you are, but that you have a safe relationship that can challenge when there's trends and patterns. Because, and I like what you said about going away to, have that own personal reflection, just think about what's going on, because really as a leader, we want to assess what are the trends and patterns. Where do I keep snagging my nail on the same, or where do I keep snagging my pants on the same nail? Where do I keep hitting my head? Why do I seem to always hire the wrong people? Why do I always get in conflict with this? Why are people not doing their job? How come everybody I hire isn't doing their job? Well, maybe it's a question for me. How am I not holding people accountable? How am I not training and equipping? How am I not onboarding well? What am I communicating? Why are people heading every direction but where the vision is? Have I communicated the vision? So we're sitting there trying to look at our trends and patterns really of where we have reoccurring challenges, reoccurring frustrations, where things are not moving as smoothly as we want them. And it's not that we're focusing on negativity. It's that for a leader to be at their top performance, we want that to be smooth. So where there's a glitch or a hang-up, we're looking at where are those glitches and hang-ups and why are those happening? And a lot of times as leaders, it's hard work. So we can get caught in blaming. We can get caught in defensiveness. We can get caught in attacking other people. If those people would do their job, and these crazy millennials, they just aren't the same work ethic, whatever. Stop the excuses, stop the blaming, because it always starts with leadership. So the opportunity is to go, what is my role in this challenge? And honestly, if the same challenge is happening to you, it's something with your leadership. So be humble enough to step back and look at those patterns to inform you, what am I doing that's contributing to creating this situation? And that's the point of this third self-reflection that's really very golden. And you can use the 360 to give you an indicator to that. Maybe you're completely clueless. I mean, I think everything's great with my team, but on the 360, they said, I don't listen to feedback. I don't even know how that's possible. Okay, great. Go for a little retreat and reflect on that, and maybe take your assessments along and see what attributes you have that might make it difficult for you to listen to what people are saying.
Yeah, no, absolutely. All those are great examples and in a self-assessment. And you know, I think the reason that you need to get away. I mean, we can always do it at home, but I really think getting away is huge. And the reason for that is nobody's around to bother you. The doorbell doesn't ring. The dog doesn't bark. The TV doesn't come on. You get that chance to. It's just you and whatever you've brought with you and yourself. And a lot of people don't like that because they may not like themselves. But that's another part of the self-assessment. Maybe what you're doing is just a reflection of your own understanding of who you are. But anyway, so that's why I think it's important to get away and just have some time by yourself to kind of think through all of that and then come out with a plan. Excuse me, a plan to move forward, to take everything that you've learned about yourself and then to move forward, experiment, get feedback, tweak, experiment, get feedback, tweak, and get those things in place. And then, you know, schedule that self-assessment every 90 days, every 180 days, so that you can evaluate on the changes that you're making.
Yeah, absolutely. I do think sometimes it's a good question. How often should you be doing this? Is this a weekly thing? Well, we all know that's unrealistic and not really possible when you're busy leading. I do really like the 90-day rhythm. It's 12 weeks, 3 months, 90 days. And in order to pick a attribute or a skill, a soft skill or a focus, and identify that, maybe it's accountability. You know, I think I'm a little squishy with accountability. I think that I don't like, it feels like hand slapping, and I think people should just do their job. Okay, great. Let's take 90 days to do that. Maybe you engage a coach to guide you or to work through that together in that 90 days. Maybe you're like, first, you're going to start with reading books on accountability and understanding what really is accountability. How am I misunderstanding what accountability is? And then maybe you do that 360 to understand, or you ask your team questions about accountability to see where you're doing it well, where you're not, and then understand the skill set to put that into place and start practicing it, get feedback. That goes back to what you were saying earlier about experiment. So you try a new agenda for your one-on-ones. You try a new system for tracking tasks that were assigned and seeing and measuring the progress. You try a new tool, Asana or whatever it is, for having a check-in and a clear task, whatever, but you experiment with it and then make adjustments. And then maybe in 90 days, you're able to move the needle enough and you're like, that's great. And you do this process again and then pick the next skill. Or you may say, you know what, I moved the needle, but there's more to do. And this is the top most important thing I need to develop. And you do it another 90 days. But a 90-day rhythm is a really, really great rhythm to actually take a skill, to seriously learn about what the upgrade is, and to practice the upgrade and make adjustments.
Yeah, I think that's a great rhythm as well, because you're never going to do something in 30 days. You're never going to be able to understand it and make that adjustment and see the results of that in 30 days. It's just too much work. And if you do it in a 90-day rhythm, then it's long enough to take one skill, to take one thing to do and adjust. And you're not trying to change your entire life at that point. You're just one thing, as Billy Crystal used to say in those City Slicker movies, were not Billy Crystal, but the other guy, one thing, and move on. That just shows my age, I'm sure. Let's just move on. And when you do that, you're not overwhelming yourself with change. And that really gets in when we start trying to change 10 things in 30 days or 90 days, or even in a year, that's a lot of work. Take one skill, focus on it for 90 days, explore it, examine it, get feedback, tweak it, experiment, and then, at that point, move on or keep working at it.
Yeah, that's good. I like your point about not doing too much is good. And then the other thing that I see sometimes with leaders is we don't really take it seriously. So we're like, all right, let's work on accountability. All right, I've identified that. I'm doing this, and on to the next thing next week. And it's almost that we don't take this soft skill building important enough, deep enough. And so we'll grab it and we almost minimize the importance of really digging in, understanding it, and upgrading it. And then really, we don't actually upgrade anything. You've identified it, but you've almost wasted the time because you've identified it. You gave it token lip service that you were going to do something about it, but you didn't really give it the time it needed in order to make a substantial change. Because if it's really an issue, it's going to require work in order to upgrade it. We don't develop, you don't go, hey, I'm going to play basketball. I went out there on Saturday, I shot 100 baskets and I'm good to go. Like, bring on the NBA, I'm ready. No, it is a practice and a discipline. So we have to treat this skill building that way too. It's a practice and a discipline. So don't minimize what it takes. If you think it's not a big deal and there's not that much to do, you're not quite understanding the depth in order to move the needle, to grow the roots in order to make that a substantial skill in your wheelhouse.
Yeah, you know, it's like my son. I have a 7-year-old, and he got a really nice drum set for Christmas. He's taking drum lessons, and so when we told him when he got the drums from Santa, we said, now you can take lessons, and he was like, I already know how to play the drums, and I'm like, And then I kept telling him, it's going to be hard work. You're going to have to do this. You're going to have to practice 3 or 4 times a week. You're going to have to, and he didn't believe me, but he's starting to believe me a little bit that this is not going to be something that he can just, go to practice, go to a lesson and bang out and not have to worry about it again. So.
Yeah, it's a great example. And, you use the example of a 7-year-old, although there's a little 7-year-old in all of us that has that ego that wants to say, oh, whatever. Okay, I'll upgrade that. It's not a big deal. But it is the ego that we have to put away. And leaders, even though we're working in our strengths, you're constantly working to keep improving your strengths to be the best leaders we can be. And you're right. A lot of times leaders sound just like that, where they're like, I already know how to play the drums. I already know how to lead a team. What are you talking about?
Exactly. Absolutely. Well, so that's it for the day. Anything else you want to share before we head out?
No, it's great. I think leaders, we just know everybody has strengths. Everyone has the opportunity to continue to upskill those strengths, and that process to assess them, expand your awareness, and then to experiment with them is really important. Using tools, team feedback, and self-reflection are 3 ways that you can do that yourself. Doing that in a regular rhythm of 90 days is a really great way to create a development plan for yourself and your leadership team. And we'd love to know what we're missing. What else do you do? Maybe there's an assessment that you love that we didn't mention. Maybe there's a tool that you use in order to get feedback from your team. We'd love to hear about that. Even now that we're talking about it, I'm thinking about more that we didn't mention, but we're out of time. We'll get that in the future. So leaders, we'd love to hear from you. What have you done that works? How has tools like this helped you? Share your experiences. We'd love to hear from you, and your leadership helps other leaders be better too.
Absolutely. Very good. Listen, we'll be back next week. And in the meantime, I hope you have a great week.
Thanks. David is off to a self retreat this weekend, which is really great. He's about to leave, which is really awesome. I have to say I'm a little jelly. I think it's a great idea, and I need to schedule one for myself.
Absolutely. And oddly enough, a great place to go if you can find a monastery around. That's a great place to go. All the ones around here are not taking people because of COVID. But it's a great place because there will be nobody to talk to you. Cell phones are, you can't get cell service in there, those kinds of things. So it's just you and who you are. So it's a great place to go. But fortunately, I'm going to a hotel, and my wife is gracious enough to allow me to do this. So I'm excited. Thanks for bringing that up. All righty.
All right. Well, have a good weekend, and we'll talk to you next week.
All right. Goodbye.